Jeremy Cole had never intended to draw attention. After 32 years of measured, consistent living, working with his hands, teaching high school shop class, and spending more weekends than he could count under the hoods of rusted-out engines, the last thing he wanted was conflict. When he left the city behind and moved into the modest, weather-worn farmhouse on the edge of Ridgway County, it wasn't to make a statement or chase some romantic notion of rural life. It was quiet out here. The sky didn't growl with sirens at night. Nobody parked in front of his driveway or laid on a horn out of impatience. The air smelled like damp soil and pine. The stillness felt earned. He had inherited the property from his uncle, a man who died without ceremony but left behind acres of underused farmland and a barn that had not seen a proper repair since Clinton's first term. The land was wild around the edges, feral thorns climbing the fences, saplings sprouting where they shouldn't. But it had good bones. The house needed work, sure. The pipes rattled, and the upstairs windows whistled when the wind cut just right, but it stood firm. And inside that leaning barn, under a heavy tarp and years of dust, Jeremy found the old International Harvester tractor. It was a monster. Paint chipped down to primer, engine full of sediment, 2 tires completely dry-rotted. But it was beautiful in its own way. He wasn't one for sentiment, but the first time he managed to get the engine to rumble back to life, it stirred something in him. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something closer to control. A broken machine made whole again. Reliable, strong, purposeful. Something he hadn't felt in himself for a long time. He didn't consider the neighbors much, mostly because there didn't seem to be any. The nearest mailbox sat half a mile up the gravel road, and the lot across the way had been vacant for years. That changed 2 months after he moved in, when a white SUV appeared on the road and stayed there. It belonged to Karen Draper. She moved in quietly, but not discreetly. The contractors showed up within days. She had flagstone walkways installed, solar lights embedded into the landscaping. A screened-in sunroom added to the back of the house. The grass was trimmed within an inch of its life, and everything, from the flower beds to the oversized bird feeder near the porch, was curated with unsettling precision. Jeremy wasn't one to judge. People liked things tidy. Fine. But it was hard not to notice how quickly her energy shifted whenever she looked toward his land, or how often she happened to be walking on the shoulder of his side of the road, eyeing his fence line like it owed her answers. It started subtly. The first interaction was forgettable, even pleasant. She waved. He nodded. The second time, she brought over a small plastic container of gluten-free brownies, told him it was a welcome-to-the-neighborhood gesture, despite the fact that he had moved in long before she had. He thanked her. She lingered, eyes drifting past him, over his shoulder, toward the barn. "You working on something in there?" she asked with an almost friendly curiosity. He told her about the tractor. Her expression shifted. A tight smile. "That must be loud," she said. "I hope it's not too disruptive for the wildlife." At first, Jeremy dismissed it as small talk. People said strange things when they didn't know how to relate. But the tone settled in his mind like grit in a gear. That week, he noticed the brownies untouched in the trash, still wrapped, mold forming under the saran wrap. He hadn't thrown them away. She had. Dropped them there herself, next to the curb outside his driveway, neatly placed on top of a bag of lawn clippings. A few days later, while replacing a worn fuel filter, Jeremy heard it. A dry cough, deliberate. Karen stood just beyond the edge of his drive, arms folded, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "I wasn't sure if you knew," she said, "but some of us work from home. The sound really carries." Jeremy stood and wiped his hands. He kept his voice neutral. "I'm usually done by 4. Shouldn't be much longer." She didn't argue. She just said, "It's not the kind of thing people expect to hear in a residential area," and walked off. That night he checked county maps. His land was zoned as mixed-use residential agricultural, which was how his uncle had kept goats on the East Field back in the 90s. There were no restrictions on owning or operating heavy equipment as long as it wasn't commercial or industrial. But Jeremy knew the comment hadn't been about zoning. It was about control. Things escalated on a Thursday. It was unseasonably warm, and Jeremy had the garage doors rolled open. He'd pulled the tractor out onto the gravel strip that bordered the barn so he could rotate the tires and test the new ignition switch. He had just finished adjusting the throttle linkage when a black SUV pulled into his driveway without warning. It wasn't Karen's. A man in a tan button-down stepped out and introduced himself as a compliance officer from the local code enforcement division. Someone had filed a report. The officer was polite enough, but the complaint wasn't. It claimed that Jeremy's tractor posed a potential threat to community safety and well-being, citing the appearance of military-grade machinery and auditory stress triggers for adjacent residents. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. It's a 1982 International Harvester. The only thing it threatens is a patch of crabgrass. The officer gave a small, uncomfortable smile but proceeded to take pictures. Jeremy didn't argue. He let the man do his job, knowing full well there were no violations, but something about the phrasing gnawed at him. When the report arrived by mail a week later, he noticed that same phrase repeated twice. Threatening presence. It wasn't about legality. It was about impression. Fear, manufactured and broadcast, leveraged as pressure. And he knew exactly who had written it, even if the signature wasn't hers. Still, Jeremy didn't react. He kept working. He moved the tractor farther down the drive, kept the engine off after sunset, even bought a sound meter and recorded the decibel levels just in case the complaints continued. They did. The letters became more specific. One accused him of intentional intimidation by mechanical display. Another claimed that the tractor's vibrational signature disrupted her sleep patterns. He was stunned, not just by the language, but by the certainty of it. Like she was building a case not based on facts, but on repetition. If she said it often enough, loud enough, maybe someone would make it true. He started parking the tractor out of view, tucked behind the barn, though it made working on it harder. He set up a camera near the edge of the drive, not to catch trespassers, but to document his own behavior. Every action calculated, every movement traceable. But the pressure worked its way under his skin. He found himself checking the window every time he heard footsteps outside. Once, he caught her taking pictures from her side of the fence, angling her phone between the slats like a nature photographer tracking elusive prey. That was when the idea took root, a slow-burning rebellion, not out of spite, but necessity. She wanted to label his tractor a menace? Fine. Let it idle, quiet and steady. Not roaring, not tearing across the field, but present, undeniable, real, not a threat, a statement, not a warning, a boundary. He waited until a night when the air was still and the moon low, rolled the tractor forward under its own power, just far enough for the hum of the engine to carry. Not loud, just enough to vibrate faintly against the quiet. He parked it in neutral, lights off, idling low, exhaust soft like a breath. Right there, at the edge of his property, facing her window. And then he went inside, made a cup of coffee, sat by the window and listened, not to the machine, to the silence around it, and to what would come next. The morning after Jeremy let the tractor idle beneath Karen's window, he woke not to sirens or yelling, but to a precise and unnatural silence. The kind of quiet that feels posed, arranged by someone with a clipboard and an agenda. It wasn't the lack of birdsong or the stillness of the trees that set him off. It was the absence of Karen's routines. No front door squeaking open. No clack of those rubber-soled flats on the pavement. No sound of her watering plants in that performatively aggressive way she had, where every splash seemed meant to be heard. The curtains in her house were drawn shut, tight as a sealed vault, and her driveway was empty. Jeremy stood at his kitchen window holding his coffee, waiting for something he couldn't name, and it came not in the form of confrontation, but a notification. It was just past 10 when his phone buzzed with an email from the county's Community Relations Office, a formal communication regarding a civilian wellness and noise complaint. It used the same language Karen always seemed to favor, all vague, emotional impact disguised as legal language. Intermittent, low-frequency mechanical emissions. Implied distress. Non-emergency psychological interference. Attached was a letter from a local therapist, addressed anonymously, stating that a resident in the immediate area had experienced elevated anxiety symptoms linked directly to mechanical disturbances occurring during nighttime hours. It didn't name Karen, but it didn't need to. The phrasing was surgical. And then came the twist. The report had been forwarded to the Department of Public Health for further review under the municipality's Environmental Noise Initiative. Jeremy wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was closer to fatigue, the kind that seeps into your bones when you realize someone has committed to misunderstanding you on purpose. He sat down at his workbench in the garage. The tractor parked just inside, engine cool and quiet now. The weight of the accusation wasn't in the specifics, which he could refute. It was in the tone. They weren't accusing him of breaking the law, they were painting him as someone who created harm, not with violence, but with presence. That was harder to fight. By noon, the first visitor arrived, a city environmental liaison, fresh haircut, pressed shirt, clipboard held like a badge, stepped onto Jeremy's driveway with a tight smile and a handheld decibel meter. "We've had a complaint," he said in the tone of someone who expected immediate cooperation. Jeremy offered him coffee, was refused, and instead stood by as the man walked slow, measured loops around the edge of the property, occasionally clicking buttons and frowning. "When was the last time the tractor was running?" he asked. Jeremy answered truthfully. "Last night for about 40 minutes. Idle only." The man scribbled that down. "And for what purpose?" Jeremy paused. "Maintenance. Testing the idle throttle stability. It's an old engine. It needs warm cycles." The inspector didn't respond. He took another lap, paused near the property line, then finally handed Jeremy a carbon copy of the visit report. "Not a violation, technically, but we're required to pass this along. You may hear from the noise abatement team next." He offered a nod that was not quite polite and left without further comment. Jeremy held the report in his hands. It was thin. 2 lines of data, 1 printed sentence of recommendation, but it felt heavier than any citation. It was a record, a precedent, the beginning of something larger. That night, Jeremy opened a file on his computer labeled Documentation and began adding entries. Dates, times, summaries of each encounter. He uploaded photos of the tractor's position. He labeled screenshots of his decibel readings and time-stamped them. He created folders for every complaint he'd received, scanned letters, recorded voice memos narrating his side of events. Not because he planned to sue anyone, not because he thought it would go to court, but because something in him recognized the momentum, the way false narratives build until they feel unshakable, unless you build a scaffold of facts strong enough to hold them back. Over the next week, the pressure increased, not in volume, but in subtlety. A surveyor's stake appeared near the back fence. No explanation, no markings, just a red flag where there hadn't been one before. Jeremy removed it and logged the location. The next day, a package addressed to Resident arrived on his porch, a pamphlet titled Living Harmoniously in Shared Spaces, with an insert on Understanding Noise Sensitivity in the Modern Age. There was no sender listed. Inside the pamphlet, someone had underlined the sentence, "Respecting your neighbors means recognizing how your choices may affect their sense of peace." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't illegal, but it was something worse, strategic. Then came the conversation that shifted everything. A sheriff's deputy pulled into his driveway late Friday afternoon, not in response to a call, but as part of what he called a community relations check-in. He was younger, calm, unarmed, and polite, but what he said peeled away any illusion that this was just a misunderstanding. "Mr. Cole, we've received a series of non-emergency reports involving your property. I'm not here to issue a citation, but I am here to advise you that some folks in the area feel unsettled." Jeremy asked, "Unsettled by what?" The deputy hesitated. "By the appearance of the equipment, by its use during unusual hours, by, let's say, the impression it gives." Jeremy didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask who filed the complaints. He didn't even deny the implication. He only said, "I operate the tractor on my land. I've kept every hour recorded. I've stayed within sound ordinances. I've never crossed anyone's property line." The deputy nodded. "I believe you, but we're in a world now where perception carries weight. I'm just giving you the heads up." That night, Jeremy didn't sleep, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The game had changed. It wasn't about the tractor. It wasn't even about noise. It was about pressure. Invisible, deniable, cumulative pressure, and the hope that he would fold quietly. Move, sell, quit, he wouldn't, but he also wouldn't retaliate. Instead, he hired a land assessor, certified, reputable, neutral, and scheduled a full boundary inspection. Not because he doubted the lines, but because he wanted it on record. He called a civil engineer and paid for an environmental impact test to certify the tractor's emissions, vibration levels, and mechanical sound output. It wasn't cheap, but it was clean, objective data. He logged it all. He shared nothing. Not yet. By the end of the week, he'd built a digital wall around himself. Every fact reinforced, every decision deliberate. But Karen didn't stop. She escalated. The next complaint wasn't about sound or appearance. It was about emotional coercion through proximity. She alleged that Jeremy had parked the tractor deliberately in her line of sight, that he had done so with knowledge of her anxiety condition, and that such behavior constituted a form of harassment. Jeremy's lawyer, whom he'd hired quietly after the second code inspection, read the letter aloud over the phone. "This is where it turns," she said. "She's reframing reality into motive. If this gets traction, it becomes a pattern. That's how they argue intent." Jeremy sat on the line, silent. Then he asked, "What do we do?" The lawyer didn't hesitate. "We go on the record. We document everything. And next time she calls the county, we're the ones ready to respond." Jeremy didn't reply. He closed the call, went out to the barn, and sat beside the tractor. The engine still quiet, the smell of oil and soil clinging to the air. He didn't start it. He didn't move it. He just rested one hand on the metal frame, solid and warm from the sun, and felt the weight of it settle into his bones. This was no longer about property or peace. This was a siege, and he would not go down easy. The next escalation didn't come in the form of confrontation. Jeremy had grown used to expecting pressure not as noise, but as silence that carried weight, like a held breath in a courtroom, or the moment before a judge renders a verdict. And that's exactly how it felt the day he came home from town to find a plain white envelope taped to his front door with industrial-grade duct tape. No stamp, no sender, just his name printed in stiff capital letters across the front. He stood on the porch, key still in hand, heart beating just a bit faster than usual as he peeled it off and opened it under the hard midday sun. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no header, no logo, no salutation. Just a typed paragraph that read more like a diagnosis than a threat. "You are now in violation of ongoing municipal mediation recommendations. Continued presence of industrial-grade equipment in direct line of sight from neighboring windows may constitute a form of sustained environmental intimidation. Consider alternative storage, relocation, or disuse of said machinery in residential adjacent zones. This is not a legal warning. It is a civic one. Jeremy reread the paragraph 3 times. He couldn't decide what was more frustrating: the vagueness, the tone, or the fact that someone had felt entitled to walk onto his property and tape that damn envelope to his door like a final notice. He placed the letter on the dining table and stared at it while the kettle boiled, his mind not racing exactly, but calculating. This wasn't a move meant to win. It was meant to wear him down, one document at a time, until he began second-guessing reality. He didn't mention it to anyone. Instead, he filed it in a folder marked Unverified Communications and added a brief entry in his log. Then, quietly, without drama, he reinforced his gate. A simple addition. Heavier hinges, a second lock. Not paranoid. Practical. On Wednesday, he returned home from the mechanics supply store and found 3 small rocks stacked neatly on the front edge of his porch railing, right by the mailbox. They weren't naturally formed like that. They'd been placed, deliberately. A marker, a game. Someone, he realized, wanted him to react. He refused. Instead, he focused on preparation. He scheduled an appointment with a licensed surveyor and asked for a fresh, stamped copy of the boundary map, just to have it in hand. He purchased 2 additional trail cameras and mounted them in less obvious places. High in the trees, angled down with a view of the eastern fence line and the gravel strip where the tractor usually sat. He didn't turn the tractor on that week. He didn't even move it. Let them stew in silence. But then came Thursday night. Jeremy had driven into town for groceries and stayed late talking with the local hardware store owner about weatherproofing a sagging section of the barn roof. When he got home, he immediately knew something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong that hits you over the head, but a quieter tension, like a rearranged room you can't name but somehow feel. He parked, stepped out, and walked straight to the barn without even unloading the groceries. The door was shut as he'd left it, padlock secure, but the air smelled off, a burnt chemical tang he hadn't smelled before. When he opened the door, everything looked normal, until he climbed up onto the tractor. His foot hit something slick, not oil, but a smear of something thicker. He pulled out a flashlight, swept it across the deck, and froze. Someone had poured liquid inside the cab. Not much, but enough to leave a sticky, amber film across the seat and floor. It smelled like solvent, not motor oil, not gasoline. Something synthetic and bitter. Jeremy didn't touch it. He backed out, closed the barn, and walked straight back to the house. He called the sheriff's department, filed a report, and requested a non-emergency dispatch to document vandalism. An officer arrived within the hour. Older, cautious, observant. He didn't downplay the situation. He took photos. He scraped samples. He asked if Jeremy had any suspects. Jeremy said no. Not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't going to hand Karen's name over without proof. The deputy appreciated that. Before he left, he said something strange. This kind of stuff, it starts slow. People think they're making a point. But if you don't shut it down early, they start to believe they've got permission. The next day, Jeremy bought a fire extinguisher specifically rated for chemical fires and mounted it inside the barn. He also changed the padlock and installed a sensor that would alert his phone if the door opened unexpectedly. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't post online. But he did move the tractor back into open view the next morning, positioning it again where it had been on that first night under Karen's window. Engine off, tires chalked, legal and documented. Let her look. Let her stew. He waited for a reaction. But this time, it came from a direction he hadn't expected. On Saturday afternoon, while mowing the stretch between the barn and the main road, Jeremy spotted a man standing at the edge of his neighbor's lawn. Late 50s, heavy-set, holding a clipboard. Not Karen. Someone else. Jeremy slowed the mower, cut the engine, and waited. The man approached, walking the long way around, sticking to the gravel rather than stepping onto the grass. When he finally reached the gate, he didn't try to come in. Just stood there and introduced himself as a field officer from the local property tax office. Said he was doing visual assessments as part of a reclassification survey. Said Jeremy's equipment had been flagged for inspection. Something about long-term stationary structures possibly being taxed differently under revised property improvement codes. Jeremy blinked. "It's a tractor," he said. The man smiled tightly. "Yes, sir, but when machinery is stored outdoors long-term, and if it occupies a consistent footprint, it may fall under a reassessment clause for external fixtures." Jeremy didn't argue. He asked for a business card. The man didn't have one, just a printed badge and a laminated sheet of instructions that looked freshly printed. Jeremy asked him to return another day once he'd consulted his attorney. The man didn't press. He left. That night, Jeremy cross-referenced the clause he'd been cited. It existed, buried in municipal tax code, a provision so obscure he doubted anyone outside of an accountant's office had read it in 20 years. It was real, but the sudden application of it wasn't coincidence. Someone had dug deep or had help. Either way, the message was the same. Pressure from every angle. Not illegal, not aggressive, just constant, like water dripping onto stone. And still, Jeremy refused to break. He responded with precision. He compiled every visit, sheriff, assessor, compliance officer, into a master document. He created a timeline. He included photographs, metadata, cross-referenced maps. Then he sent a courtesy notification to his lawyer, who in turn reached out to the county's legal department not to escalate, but to alert them. This citizen is being subjected to a pattern of targeted administrative pressure. All inquiries will now be routed through counsel. 2 days later, the man from the property office called to say the reassessment visit had been canceled. Jeremy didn't celebrate. He just went outside, turned the ignition, and let the tractor idle for the first time in 5 days. Not loud, not long, just enough to remind them. He was still here, still standing, still legal, still not afraid. The tension between them didn't break. It thickened. By the time July settled over the valley, heavy with heat and cicadas, the silence between Jeremy and Karen had solidified into something more than hostility. It had become structure, a framework through which every movement was interpreted, every sound measured, every glance weaponized. The tractor was no longer just a machine in his yard. It had become a stand-in for his presence itself, a proxy she could file reports against, a silhouette she could claim was staring into her home even when it hadn't moved in days. What had begun as passive friction now pulsed with the careful rhythm of a campaign. Jeremy felt it with each step he took toward the barn, with every decision he made about where to park, how long to let the engine run, even whether to leave the overhead lights on after dark. Her eyes were everywhere, even when her blinds were closed. What changed wasn't her. It was the strategy. She stopped trying to create direct interference, no more packages or unsourced letters. Instead, she took a cleaner route. A letter arrived from the local Civil Coordination Committee, an entity Jeremy didn't even know existed until that week, informing him that due to the cumulative impact of reported incidents involving his equipment, a formal mediation hearing had been scheduled. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't court. It wasn't even mandatory. But it had the weight of official concern, and it gave her, for the first time, a sanctioned venue to present her version of the story. His lawyer, Laura, called it a trap from the beginning. It's voluntary, yes, but if you don't attend, they'll say you're uncooperative. If you do attend, they'll record everything you say and try to shape it into an admission. This isn't about law. It's about appearance. Jeremy listened, weighed her advice, and decided to go anyway. But not alone. He brought documentation, timelines, sound meter data, photographs, and he brought a calm that he'd learned to carry like armor. The meeting took place in a converted municipal room, the kind with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, more suited to bingo nights than conflict resolution. Karen was already seated when he arrived, dressed in a pale blouse and a tightly wound smile, flanked by a man introduced as her wellness advocate. Across from them, Jeremy sat quietly, Laura beside him, hands folded, expression unreadable. The mediator was a gray-haired woman with an academic posture and a voice like warm water, gentle, regulated, quietly firm. She opened with a request for civility and asked Karen to begin. What followed wasn't a presentation. It was a performance. Karen described the tractor in terms usually reserved for domestic warfare. A machine that loomed, emitted low-level psychological noise, and served as a constant visual provocation. She referenced studies about noise pollution, sleep disruption, PTSD triggers, and even cited a university paper on the mental impact of ambient industrial presence in suburban environments. Her language was calm, clipped, precise. Every sentence ended like it had been practiced. The wellness advocate nodded occasionally, as if confirming data points from some unseen research log. Karen never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had mastered the art of polished grievance, wrapped in concern. When it was Jeremy's turn, he didn't match her tone. He didn't even try. He spoke plainly, methodically. He showed photographs, dated, time-stamped, labeled. He provided readings of engine noise from multiple distances. He showed the boundary map, official property zoning permits, the letter from the tax office rescinding the reassessment, and the sheriff's vandalism report. He never mentioned Karen's name, never accused. He framed it as a pattern of overreach. The mediator took notes but offered nothing in response except a polite nod and a thank you. Afterward, in the hallway, Karen passed him with a calmness that struck him as rehearsed. "It's not personal," she said softly, "but some people aren't compatible with peaceful neighborhoods." She didn't wait for a reply. Jeremy said nothing. Laura did. "We'll be following up in writing," she said sharply. Karen's heels clicked away. The next day, Jeremy received a call from the county office informing him that while no penalties would be issued from the mediation, the committee recommended a cooperative approach to neighborhood engagement, including limiting mechanical operation hours to daylight and establishing equipment screening if feasible. Nothing binding, nothing actionable, but a paper trail, a suggestion, a beginning. He forwarded the message to Laura. She responded with 2 words: "Stay steady." That night, Jeremy walked the perimeter of his property slowly, checking the sensor lights, inspecting the fence, letting the dark settle around him. There were no new markers, no strange smells, no unexpected visitors. But the air carried a kind of density. Not of danger, but of intention. Everything now had weight. The location of the tractor, the time of day he used it, whether he waved to a neighbor or simply nodded. Karen had escalated the field of play not through aggression, but with bureaucracy and optics. And Jeremy understood what that meant. The battle wasn't about legality anymore. It was about leverage. It was about who blinked first. So he did what she wouldn't expect. He didn't start the tractor the next morning. He didn't roll it out or idle it by the fence. Instead, he took a folding chair to the center of the yard and simply sat, coffee in hand, hat low, watching the horizon. No sound, no movement, nothing to report. Let her explain that. It began again on a Monday morning, not with noise or confrontation, but with something quieter and far more dangerous. Paperwork. Jeremy found the letter in his mailbox, tucked between a tool supply catalog and a local charity flyer. The envelope was thick, embossed with the seal of the Regional Dispute Resolution Bureau, and it contained 3 neatly stapled pages of legalese that, once translated, meant only one thing. Karen had formally filed a civil complaint against him for targeted environmental harassment, intentional emotional disruption, and sustained nuisance through mechanical provocation. There was a docket number, a scheduled hearing date, and a notification that he was being served under the Residential Siege Tranquility Act. A piece of local legislation passed a few years prior in response to a wave of suburban construction noise, rarely invoked and never tested in court. Jeremy read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't pace, didn't call anyone. He just sat, drank in silence, and stared at the grain of the wood table like it might offer him a new strategy. Laura, his attorney, picked up on the second ring. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she'd expected something like this, but the language of the complaint made her pause. It was tactical. It wasn't just a repetition of prior accusations. It referenced new events, a supposed incident in which Jeremy had allegedly maneuvered his tractor into direct view of the complainant while she was in a vulnerable state of mental distress, and another where he'd restarted the engine in close proximity to the property line after previously agreeing to restrict operation to non-sensitive hours. Jeremy had never agreed to anything. The mediation had been informal and yielded no binding outcome, but now Karen had spun it into a verbal contract and accused him of breaking it. Worse, she had added a witness, a woman he didn't know, allegedly a visiting friend, who had submitted a signed affidavit supporting the claim. Laura requested a copy of the affidavit and began drafting a response, but the problem wasn't legal. Not yet. The problem was that now, officially, someone had put Jeremy's name on a public record associated with emotional harm. That week, he noticed small shifts in behavior. The mail carrier no longer waved. The woman at the hardware store, usually chatty, seemed tense. A man he didn't recognize slowed his truck while passing, just long enough to make eye contact, then drove off. None of it was proof, but the tone of the air had changed. It wasn't just about noise anymore. It was about who he was, or rather, who people were being told he was. The sheriff's department called on Thursday to confirm his side of a new incident, a report of nonverbal confrontation on his front lawn. Jeremy hadn't left the property that day. The deputy confirmed there was no corroboration, no security footage, just the report. But it was logged. Another layer, another crack. He took action in the only way that still mattered. He became even more methodical. He logged every movement of the tractor, every time the ignition turned over, every moment it spent outside the barn. He used a time-stamped mobile app that recorded GPS coordinates and engine data, downloaded the files, stored them in a locked external drive. He installed a small motion-sensitive dash camera facing the barn door, not pointed toward her property, but back toward his own. If anything happened to the tractor again, sabotage, tampering, he'd have footage. He also reached out to an old acquaintance, a former systems engineer who now specialized in digital forensic tracking, not to investigate Karen, but to analyze the unknown devices he'd found months earlier, the tracker near the wheel well, the Wi-Fi pings that had come from the direction of her house. The engineer reviewed the logs and confirmed they were legitimate intrusion attempts. The tracker had been a short-range Bluetooth beacon, likely placed temporarily and remotely pinged to verify presence. The Wi-Fi connection attempt had originated from a device named Karen Cam, and the MAC address registered to a commercial outdoor surveillance system. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough for Laura to prepare a countersuit, conditional on the outcome of the upcoming hearing. "Let her be the one to walk into this courtroom with a story," Laura said. "We'll walk in with data." The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday, held in a small municipal courtroom 2 towns over. Jeremy wore a collared shirt, pressed jeans, clean boots. Karen arrived with a small entourage, the wellness advocate from mediation, the supposed friend who had signed the affidavit, and a new face, a clean-cut man introduced as her legal advisor. Not a lawyer, Jeremy noted. Just someone who knew how to talk in rooms like this. The judge, mid-50s, impatient, unimpressed, opened with a statement about the unique nature of the case. He acknowledged the novelty of invoking the Residential Tranquility Act in this context, but allowed it to proceed due to procedural correctness. Karen's representative spoke first, painting a picture of relentless ambient disruption, weaponized machinery, a calculated campaign of subtle provocation. He described Jeremy's property as mechanically hostile, a phrase that made the judge raise one eyebrow. Karen spoke briefly, describing sleepless nights, elevated heart rate, a fear of stepping outside her own home. Her friend confirmed witnessing a threatening display, though offered no detail. When it was their turn, Laura stood slowly and without theatrics presented a three-part defense. First, the zoning laws. Agricultural permission predated Karen's arrival, grandfathered in by county code. Second, the data. Engine noise levels well below the required decibel threshold confirmed by independent testing. Third, the timeline. Every alleged incident cross-referenced with recorded engine use logs, each entry corroborated with digital tracking data, motion sensors, and mobile logs. No discrepancies. No patterns of harassment. No intent, only routine maintenance and legally protected use. Jeremy didn't speak until the judge asked him directly, "Why do you think she's done all this?" He paused, looked at Karen, then answered, "I think she wants me gone. And she knows the law won't get her what she wants, so she's trying to make it personal enough that I'll leave on my own." The courtroom was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that's hard to break. Then the judge asked Karen's representative if they had any response. They didn't. The judge dismissed the complaint. No sanctions, no fines, no orders. He made a note to the clerk stating that the plaintiff had not demonstrated a sustained pattern of unlawful behavior, nor any compelling evidence of malicious intent on the part of the defendant. It wasn't just a win. It was an erasure, a complete dismantling of the narrative she had tried to build. But Jeremy didn't celebrate, because 2 nights later he woke to a noise outside, not loud, but sharp, like a foot snapping a twig. He got up, stepped to the window, and saw nothing. But in the morning the barn door was slightly ajar. The lock had been cut, not broken, cut clean. Inside, the tractor was untouched, but a single bolt had been loosened on the rear wheel hub, just enough to be noticed if you looked. He called the sheriff again. This time, he gave a name. The call to the sheriff's department that morning was calm, clinical. Jeremy didn't embellish, didn't speculate. He simply described what he'd found. The severed lock, the loosened bolt, the fact that it hadn't been an accident. He didn't accuse directly, but when they asked if he had reason to suspect someone, he gave a name. Karen Draper. The deputy on the line went quiet for a moment before responding that they'd send someone out that afternoon. It wasn't urgency. It was caution. The tone of people who'd been told to proceed carefully because now the case had layers. Not just noise complaints and neighborly tension, but potential property damage, personal conflict, and public record. By the time the patrol car pulled into the driveway just past noon, Jeremy had already photographed the scene, bagged the severed lock in a zippered evidence pouch, and printed out the footage from the barn camera showing a figure entering frame, briefly at 3:41 a.m. No face, but a body type, a silhouette, the outline of someone familiar enough to stir recognition without confirming it. Deputy Klein was the same officer who had come during the solvent incident weeks ago. He had a clipped, quiet demeanor, not unfriendly, but clearly weighing every word he used. He inspected the lock, took photos, asked Jeremy to replay the footage. When he saw the shadow moving near the tractor, he exhaled through his nose, just once. "You're not wrong about who that looks like," he said, almost to himself. Jeremy didn't press. He just nodded and handed over a printed timeline of all previous incidents, each with references to prior reports. Klein thanked him, said they'd file it as a criminal mischief report and that they'd be in contact soon. He paused before leaving. "You're documenting everything the right way," he said. "Just be careful. People who escalate quietly can be the hardest to predict." That night, Jeremy didn't start the tractor. He didn't sit on the porch. He kept the lights off, locked the gates, set the alarms, and stayed inside. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense, like a vacuum waiting to collapse. The day after the report, Laura called him with news. Someone, unnamed, had reached out to the county office to inquire about any ongoing disputes involving Jeremy. The inquiry was registered, but not filed. It was an informal contact, logged, but not confirmed. "She's checking the pulse," Laura said, "seeing how much pressure she can still apply without leaving fingerprints." What Karen hadn't expected was that Jeremy wasn't the same man he'd been a month ago. He no longer reacted with hesitation. He responded with precision. That same week, he filed a civil protection order, not an accusation of violence, but a request for a boundary. A no-contact agreement based on repeated unwanted contact, documented intrusion, and potential tampering with private property. The paperwork was clear, factual, emotionless. It wasn't retaliation, it was preservation. But before the motion could be heard, Karen struck again, this time not through sabotage but through spectacle. On a Saturday morning, Jeremy awoke to find 3 marked county vehicles parked across the street, orange safety cones lining the shoulder, and a group of men in reflective vests walking his fence line. When he stepped outside, one of them approached with a clipboard and explained they were conducting an emergency utility review, following an anonymous tip about improper underground fuel storage. The implication was clear. Someone had reported him for storing illegal diesel reserves. Something not only untrue but potentially career-damaging if escalated. Jeremy asked to see the warrant or inspection order. They had none. It was a voluntary assessment. If he refused, they'd note it and escalate it to the fire marshal. He refused, politely, firmly. He recorded the entire exchange on his phone, noting that he was not being presented with a warrant and that he was reserving all legal rights. The crew left. No samples were taken, but the damage was done. Another record, another complaint, another suggestion of impropriety in a system that rarely differentiated between allegations and evidence. That afternoon, Laura filed a formal request for a cease and desist letter to be issued through the county clerk's office, outlining a pattern of behavior consistent with targeted harassment. Jeremy also filed an affidavit with the sheriff's office requesting that any further property-related complaints involving him be logged as coordinated interference until otherwise determined. The documentation now filled 2 folders, one for legal defense, one for proactive measures. His house, once quiet and clean of clutter, had become an archive of resilience. Still, Karen didn't stop. 3 days later, she tried to press a private citizen's petition to reclassify his property as a non-conforming land use zone, citing detrimental community impact through unresolved mechanical disturbances. It failed immediately, rejected by the zoning board on procedural grounds, but it proved her intent. She wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to build a wall around him, brick by brick, made of paperwork and whispers and thinly veiled accusations. That evening, Jeremy stood in his garage, door open to the fading light, looking at the tractor. It hadn't been started in days. The air was still, the fields silent. He walked around the machine slowly, hand brushing the chipped red paint, the old logo, the rust near the joints. Then he climbed into the seat, pressed the ignition, and let the engine turn over. It rumbled once, coughed, then roared to life, a deep, earthy sound that cut across the property like thunder. He throttled down, letting it idle low, smooth and steady. Then, without ceremony, he backed it out, rolled it forward, and parked it again. Not against the barn, not halfway down the lot, but right at the edge of the property, facing Karen's house, engine still running. She came out 10 minutes later, as expected. No yelling, no drama. Just a phone in her hand, camera pointed, face blank. He waved. She said nothing. She turned and went back inside. He let the tractor idle until sunset, then shut it off, rolled it back into the barn, and locked the door. That night, there were no calls, no sirens, no knocks on the door. Just wind in the trees and the feeling that, for the first time in weeks, the message had finally been received. He wouldn't fold, he wouldn't run, he wouldn't be erased. Summer began to wane slowly, and with it, the intensity of the standoff that had consumed Jeremy's life for months began to cool. Not because a clear victor had emerged, but because momentum, like fuel, eventually runs dry. Karen had grown quieter. Not in a peaceful way, but in a calculated retreat. A drawing back into silence that hinted not at resolution, but at recalibration. Her windows stayed shut most days, the blinds drawn, the porch undisturbed. There were no more inspectors, no more anonymous letters, no patrol cars idling by the curb pretending not to watch. For the first time in weeks, Jeremy could walk to his barn without feeling like each step was being measured from across the property line. But still, he didn't relax. Not fully. The tension hadn't vanished. It had simply gone underground. The court denied Karen's petition for reclassification without hearing. A terse response from the zoning board citing lack of evidence and procedural abuse. Her civil complaint had been dismissed, her affidavit-backed accusations effectively neutralized by documented fact. And though Jeremy's protection order had yet to be finalized, it was moving through the system with slow but steady progress. Laura had told him plainly, "Sometimes the biggest win is getting them to stop swinging before you ever need to strike." And yet, Jeremy didn't feel victorious. What he felt was something closer to clarity. Not a sense of triumph, but of definition. He finally understood what she had tried to do. It wasn't about tractors or noise or peace and quiet. It was about erasure. She wanted to unmake him, to push his presence out of the neighborhood one complaint at a time, one insinuation after another, until he'd begin to wonder whether staying was worth the price. That was the cruelty of it. Not the drama, but the erosion. The slow removal of dignity masked as concern. But it hadn't worked. He kept the tractor parked in plain view now, not as defiance, but as reality. It was a machine, a part of his work, his property, his right. It no longer needed to be a symbol. It just existed, like he did, unyielding and present. One morning, he rolled it down the gravel path toward the lower field, not to make a point, but because the fencing needed reinforcing, and he was finally ready to reclaim the land that had been neglected while he fought invisible battles. As he worked, he noticed something that stopped him cold, a small handwritten note, folded and pinned with a thumbtack to the inside of his front gate. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't signed. It simply read, "Some of us saw what she did. You didn't deserve any of it. Keep going." It wasn't proof, but it was something more valuable, acknowledgement. For the first time, Jeremy understood he hadn't been alone. Others had seen the tension play out, had watched from behind curtains and across driveways, too afraid or too wary to speak, but not blind to the truth. That was the way with conflict in quiet places. People watched, waited, and remembered, and in time, silence turned to understanding. A month later, Karen's house went dark. No official announcement, no for sale sign. Just a moving truck one morning, boxes being loaded with sharp, practiced efficiency. She didn't wave. She didn't say goodbye, and Jeremy didn't need her to. She left the same way she had lived, making everything about control, right down to the end. But it was over. The last engine had started. The last accusation had landed. And Jeremy remained. That evening, he sat on his porch with a beer in hand, watching the light fade over the trees, the silhouette of the barn behind him casting long shadows across the gravel. There were no sounds except the wind and the quiet ticking of cooling metal. The land felt his again, not reclaimed by force, but simply because he hadn't given it up. Weeks passed, and the silence held. A young couple moved into Karen's old place, polite, inquisitive, and mercifully disinterested in what had come before. The man introduced himself as Vince, mentioned something about classic cars, and asked whether Jeremy had ever rebuilt a Willys. Jeremy smiled for the first time in a long while. "Only once," he said, "and never again."